Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the high-stakes reality of the 2026 conflict in West Asia. It's a situation that is literally dominating headlines, disrupting global markets, and reshaping geopolitics as we speak. But, beyond the 24/7 breaking news alerts, what's actually driving this whole crisis? Well, we're going to pull back the curtain on the visible hostilities and uncover the hidden systemic drivers right beneath the surface. Using the latest reports and some really fascinating academic research, we'll figure out exactly how we ended up here. Let's get right into the current situation. As of early April 2026, the U.S. military campaign, officially called Operation Epic Fury, is in full swing. President Donald Trump gave a White House address with a pretty confident assessment, saying the U.S. is winning bigger than ever before. Now, what's really interesting here is the explicit framing. He firmly insisted that this war is absolutely not about oil. He declared the U.S. is totally independent from the Middle East energy-wise, and they're strictly in this fight to back their allies.
And those alliances? They're exactly what structures this massive, sprawling regional war. Let's look at who's actually involved. On one side, we've got the United States teaming up with regional powers like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. Facing off against them is Iran, backed by what's known as the Axis of Resistance. That includes groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various mobilization forces over in Iraq. So yeah, it's an incredibly complex web of state and non-state actors locked in direct confrontation.
To really grasp the gravity of this, we've got to look at the human toll. The conflict kicked off in late February 2026, and the devastation is already immense. We're looking at an early reported death toll of 3,468 Iranians, and that number actually includes the targeted assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. On the coalition side, the U.S. reported losing 15 soldiers, along with significant casualties from Israeli and Gulf forces. These aren't just statistics. They represent a terrifyingly rapid escalation of military force. And the fallout isn't just staying on the battlefield either. It is spilling directly into the global economy, and honestly, probably into your daily life. Iran made the move to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is this absolutely vital maritime choke point, and it just sent massive shockwaves through the energy market. We are literally witnessing one of the largest global oil supply disruptions in history. The immediate economic shock? Looming fuel shortages. Asia is expected to get hit first, with Europe right behind them. It just goes to show how tied together global security and our everyday economic stability really are. So it all boils down to this. We are looking at a devastating war with massive global consequences. But a conflict like this doesn't just happen overnight in a vacuum, right? It really forces us to ask, how on earth did we get stuck on this hostile path? To understand the headlines of 2026, we have to pivot away from the current devastation and take a deep dive into the decades of geopolitical policy that paved the way to this exact moment. Because, let's be clear, this war is not an anomaly. It's the climax of a very long, very fraught history. The real turning point was the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which flipped Iran from a close U.S. partner into a fierce adversary. And that was immediately followed by the trauma of the 1980 hostage crisis. Sure, we've seen attempts at diplomacy since then, like the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, but those got undone pretty fast, like when the U.S. exited the agreement in 2018. The overall trend? It's been overwhelmingly pointing toward the exact escalation we're seeing in 2026.
To understand why this timeline looks the way it does, we can actually look at an academic concept called path dependency. Researchers explain that when the U.S. lost Iran as a strategic partner during the Cold War, it triggered a massive geopolitical shift. That initial break essentially created a default setting of hostility. And once that path was set in motion, later events, the hostage crisis, proxy wars, the deep mutual suspicion, they just acted as self-reinforcing processes. Reversing course becomes incredibly difficult, even when it might logically make sense to do so. On the surface, that path dependency is kept alive by a clear set of geopolitical flashpoints. These are the issues fueling the threat perceptions on both sides for over 40 years. You've got the persistent concerns over the Iranian nuclear program, Iran's backing of regional proxies, a deeply entrenched mutual mistrust, and just fundamentally competing visions for what the Middle East should look like. These are the visible drivers, the stuff policymakers point to every single day. But beneath those visible flashpoints is a completely different dynamic. This research paper from City Research Online takes us straight to the base of the iceberg. The researchers argue that US-Iran relations aren't solely driven by geopolitics. Actually, they're heavily constrained by a cyclical domestic logic inside the United States, Specifically, Washington's ability to even engage with Tehran is systematically dictated by the pressures of the U.S. electoral calendar. It's all about the elections. They break down the American political calendar into 3 distinct phases, and each one creates a totally different environment for foreign policy. First, you have the honeymoon phase, right after an election. Then, the re-election phase as the next campaign starts ramping up. And finally, the lame duck phase during a president's final term. Let's see how each of these phases systematically traps U.S.-Iran relations in this endless cycle of hostility.
Starting with Phase 1, the honeymoon. So a newly elected president might want to use their fresh mandate to seek some diplomatic rapprochement. Think about President Obama offering early dialogue to Iran's supreme leader. But that window, it closes remarkably fast. Congressional patience for slow, unpopular diplomatic initiatives is practically zero. Because untangling these deep-seated issues takes a lot of time, a president's initial desire to engage usually gets crushed by the reality on Capitol Hill, where lobbying and public opinion are demanding a much tougher stance.
Then we hit Phase 2, the re-election minefield.
As that honeymoon ends and the next election gets closer, the political calculus flips completely. Engaging with a historical adversary like Iran suddenly goes from a bold diplomatic move to an incredibly toxic political liability. Presidents get hyper-aware of public opinion. And since the American public has held on to this durable enmity toward Iran since 1979, looking soft on Tehran is basically a fast track to losing an election. There's a quote from the research that hits the nail on the head. From a political standpoint, nobody pays a price to be tough on Iran. Domestic pressure heavily incentivizes punitive measures. We saw this with the Clinton administration in the mid-90s. They rushed into heavy economic sanctions right before an election, just because the incentive to look tough was too strong to ignore.
Finally, Phase 3, lame ducks and second terms. Once a president is safely re-elected and doesn't have to face the voters again, they finally have the domestic breathing room to act. This is exactly when President Obama successfully negotiated the JCPOA nuclear deal. But there's a trap here too, because time is running out. Agreements made by a lame duck president face severe legacy issues. There's a huge risk that a successor from the opposing party will just come in and undo all that work. The researchers from City St. George's came to a brilliant conclusion. For a lasting peace to actually work, you need a near impossible alignment. You need favorable international geopolitics perfectly synchronized with the permissive domestic electoral phase in Washington. And since those two clocks almost never strike midnight at the same time, the default setting of hostility almost always wins out.
Now let's pull this powerful academic theory sharply back into the reality of April 2026. The fallout of Operation Epic Fury is still very much ongoing. Reports are showing a military stalemate after those maximum pressure tactics peaked, and yeah, a temporary ceasefire has been holding since April 8th, but that massive crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, it's completely unresolved, and global energy markets are still in absolute turmoil. The underlying issues haven't been fixed at all. When we synthesize all these pieces together, a really clear picture emerges. The headlines you're seeing about the 2026 war aren't just about missiles, proxies, or oil routes. This conflict is the devastating collision of path-dependent geopolitics on the world stage, mixed with the brutal calculus of domestic political survival back in Washington. To really understand the decisions leaders are making, you have to look at the electoral pressures constantly churning right beneath the surface of their foreign policy. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought to ponder. As you watch the events of 2026 unfold, ask yourself, does the constant need for domestic political survival at home dictate the inevitability of war abroad? Are the constraints of the electoral calendar so rigid that they actually make lasting peace impossible? It's a sobering question for sure, but understanding this framework gives you a powerful new lens for looking at international conflict. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what really drives those headlines.